Here's again. This is how Australians greet each other. It translates as "how's it going?", which is our way of saying hello. We blend our words together because well, it's too hot to say them individually. Hi, I'm Wayne. I'm a type designer from Australia, and this presentation is about ABC Sans, the font you're looking at on screen right now. Let's get into it. The brief that was given to me to design this font was 12, 13 pages long, so I've distilled it down to three main points here. Number one, how might the ABC create a coherent experience through identity and through typography so that people, no matter where they see ABC content, know that it's come from the ABC? Number two, how can this font help to create a uniquely distinguished identity for the ABC? Um, and how can this font help to carry that identity through all content? And number three, how can this typeface help to reflect Australia's multicultural identity? So all of that's no mean feat for a simple font. On top of that, the font had to work on all possible devices at as many sizes as possible. And it also had to be more legible than basically any font in history. So yeah, a very big ask. So the first thing that I thought was, okay, if I need to design a font that represents Australia, let's look at other countries and fonts that represent them. Which is not an easy thing to do because fonts generally have not been designed to represent a country or a people. They tend to come to represent those things over time. So Helvetica, for instance, which is renowned for its precision and neutrality, and it is Swiss designed, and those could be very well considered cultural traits of the Swiss nation. On the right there, you can see the London Underground typeface at the top and Gill Sands at the bottom in the BBC logo. The London Underground face was designed for that purpose for London transport, but it's been in use for 100 plus years and has become so associated with London's transport system that it's kind of become associated with Britishness and become the quintessential British font. Gill Sans very much in a similar way because Gill Sans is originally a derivation of Johnston Sands. I also looked at international sporting events that had cultural references in them. So the obvious ones are things like World Cups and Olympic Games. Um, for example, if you have a quick look across those, most people would look at those typefaces that say each country and say, well, yeah, they carry some cultural traits of those countries. But it's extremely difficult to define exactly what makes it Korean or Brazilian or Russian. If we look at the Brazilian one in the middle there, for example, Brazilian football, Brazilian soccer has long been known for its emphasis on individual flair and enterprise, very much more so than many other countries and regions around the world whose football might be, for instance, much more defensive or much more heavily structured. The Qatar one at the bottom right corner there of the upcoming World Cup is interesting too. It shows that sort of extended baseline on the T, which is an oblique reference to Arabic text and Arabic calligraphy without the text actually being in Arabic language. So having looked at all of these different countries in various fonts that kind of represent their regions or areas, my next step is to understand what the Australian voice is. What is the Australian national identity so that I can then try and find a way of representing that in a font. And in my research and my discussions with people, stuff like this invariably came up very quickly. It's known as the wide brown land, which is familiar to all Australians, but albeit very much a cliche, because Australia has large areas of desert. But um, imagery like this is not very representational because 80+% of Australia's population lives within a thin coastal strip around the eastern and southern side of the Australian continent. So imagery like this instead is much more representational and much more recognizable to all Australians. And looking through all of this stuff, I started to wonder, what is it that's common to all of these things? And then I looked at the sky at the top of that image and the sky at the top of the previous image as well. I just flip back so that you can see. And it's almost always sunny here in Australia. This sky is huge and open and enormous. So we have a very well-known author, Australian author by the name of Tim Winton, who writes about Australian identity a lot. And he had one quote from one of his books. The book was called Island Home. And the quote was, "Our impossibly open sky dwarfing everything," which I think is a very much an Australian thing. This sky defines much of our daily life. The sun beats down from it. We spend our time in the summer trying to avoid the heat of the sun, but we still live much of our lives in outdoor kind of settings. Tim Winton also said, "Australia remains a place with more land than people." So through this, I started to latch onto this idea of open space as a key kind of component of our national identity. And I started to wonder, how could I apply this in a typeface? So I eventually settled on generically a concept of this nature. I wanted to produce a sans serif font that had a wider than usual measure and had this sense of generosity of space around it. So you can see the width comparison between Arial and my drawings in the top line. But if you look at the bottom, I also had this intent to open up all the apertures as much as possible. Wherever there's an aperture, I wanted to try and keep it nice and open, so that letters carried this kind of subconscious sense of generous space, which I hoped Australians would identify with. This is the primary alphabet that I came up with as the original concept for this. Now, bearing in mind at this point, it's just a set of vectors. It's not typable yet, and I have yet to actually get it approved by my client, which is what this image refers to. This was the day of my presentation meeting at the ABC's offices in Sydney. Now, I took this photo while we were waiting for one of the senior managers to come from another meeting and sit in on my presentation. You can see the projector on the right-hand end of the table there. So my job was to stand there, and I had about 20 minutes to present my idea in but much the same way as I've just shown you, but in more detailed. Um, and just as I was about to start my presentation, the two guys on the left there with the camera, they looked at me and said, "Oh, by the way, Wayne, we're going to record this presentation for possible future inclusion in a documentary." And I looked at them and I thought, "Thank you guys. I was looking for a bit of extra pressure. I really appreciate that." But thankfully, straight after the meeting, they gave me immediate approval to proceed. They said, "Yes, your concept is great and it's totally on track with what we want." So the whole project almost immediately became a mechanical one. The general concept had been settled. It's just a matter of applying this concept to a typeface. And so as we go through that long mechanical stage in typeface development, legibility becomes a critical driving factor for many of the remaining design decisions. As an example, I chose Gill Sans on the left there, designed way back in the 1930s, and compared four particular characters with what I've done on the right. So Gill Sans on the left, those four letters from left to right are capital I, lowercase l, and the numeral 1. And you can see how 3 out of those 4, and at small sizes even the fourth, could easily be visually confused with each other. Can you imagine using Gill Sans in passwords in this day and age, for instance? So my legibility features among the font were things like a little crossbar on the top of the I, a hook base on the L, and another horizontal bar on the top of the number 1. Some alternative versions of the one had a baseline bar as well. And that's just some of the many legibility features built into this font to try and make sure that it's as recognizable and functional as possible. But that wasn't the only thing that I had to deal with. The ABC has a mandate to provide content that is as accessible and non-discriminatory as possible, and that includes people with, for instance, reading disabilities such as dyslexia. And mirror image letters can be a real problem for people with certain forms of dyslexia. There are many mirror image letters throughout the lowercase alphabet, and here's just a couple of example pairs. So our solution was to produce the spurs on the top of the letters on P and Q, and also B and D at the baseline to make sure that they're a little bit different from each other, to help try and distinguish visually these letters, or find other ways of distinguishing them other than their orientation. Same applies with U and N on the right there. The place where the bowl joins the stem was different, and the size of the spur was different, and the overall width of the two letters was a little bit different as well. All of this culminated in an entire day spent at the ABC's offices in Sydney with the design team, where we put large copies of each letter up on the wall and discussed them in forensic detail and drew on them, and then I would make adjustments in my font software and upload a beta version to the web so that they could test the font in live content. And you can see on the left there, we had a table that was overflowing with devices, as many different kinds and operating systems and sizes as we could to be able to test this all out. And all of this was just to reach a conclusion on the basic regular weight of the typeface, which is the second one from the top there. So when that was ultimately approved, all of those design decisions encapsulated in that regular weight were then translated to other weights, the light, the bold, and the black. And furthering on from that, some specialty weights such as an italic, the bold condensed, second from the top there, is being used nowadays for display purposes primarily. There are also two rounded weights that were used for children's programming that were based on the same DNA of the original font. So in April 2018, this new graphic identity was launched with my font in it, and I just turned on my television one morning on the ABC 24 news channel to see my font suddenly as part of this new identity, which was very much a surreal experience. I'll just play you a quick video that shows how the fonts were built into as part of this kind of graphic identity.
Now let's talk sport. Georgie Tunney joins us.
He's known in Afghanistan as the man who has helped 100,000 people walk again.
Some breaking news has just come in. The ABC.
Good morning and welcome to News Breakfast.
Know the story.
Know the story.
So around 12 months after that, the ABC's primary news and entertainment channel, ABC One, also had a brand overhaul that involved the use of the ABC Sans fonts as well. And this was very fascinating for me too, because it was the first chance I got to see the fonts in use outside of a news context. Part of the original brief to me was we want this font to have a newsy tone, but not so serious that it can't be used for entertainment and general purpose use as well. And so this is where it's started to be rolled out in Australia's and the ABC's wider kind of branding. Nowadays, it's been a couple of years now beyond that point, and the ABC Sans is at the centre of every single piece of branding that the ABC does. So what's been the response since it's been out there? People often ask me this. Well, it's been overwhelmingly positive, but it did generate some controversy at the time. On the left is a conservative commentator named Chris Kenny, and on his segment, he had a segment complaining the ABC was wasting taxpayer dollars by creating a corporate font all of their own. He said in his segment, and I quote, Times New Roman, sorry, he actually said New Times Roman or Comic Sans, none of that's good enough for the ABC. So he didn't even have enough research to quote the name of Times New Roman properly. On the right is James Patterson, is a senator from Victoria, Australia, also from the conservative side of politics, who in a Senate estimates hearing was questioning the spending of this money on a font, and basically said the same thing. What's wrong with an off-the-shelf font, which is what ABC had been using, for many decades before that. And well, what's wrong with an off-the-shelf font is the fact that you pay licensing for those fonts for a large number of employees in the many multiples of thousands and in some cases, with some of those fonts, that licensing is payable on an annual basis. So the part of the ABC's motivation for doing this was to produce a font that they had exclusive ownership over and would only have to pay for once. So I like to think that I did my bit for the national budget. Just to wrap it up, here's some stats about the project. It went over a roughly 18-month period. There were 11 fonts in the set ultimately. There were 21 number of betas. That means every time I had to make a change and then send it back to get approved, it would create a new beta version of the font for testing. 4,345 individually vectored characters. Yay, that was fun. There were upwards of 30,000 kerning pairs across all of the fonts, and the destination screens somewhere north of 20 million, who knows, possibly way more than that. An awful lot to make sure that it performs on every single possible screen. In conclusion, well, a job like this is once in a lifetime, once in a career, and it was an absolute privilege to work on. The collaborative experience with the design team at ABC was nothing short of fantastic, and the ultimate outcome, I think, owes as much to them as it does to myself. The big question is, does it contain the national character? Well, how do you judge that? There's no way of measuring that. I like to think that since I grew up with the ABC, watching it every day, and since I'm, an Australian, then the font might be infused with a certain Aussiness. But I'm really interested in people's comment about that from both Australians and others from overseas. So I just wanted to say thank you for listening. If you do want to know more detail, there's a web address on screen that shows a case study, a detailed case study. And please go ahead and forward me. Please go ahead and follow me on Instagram. There's my Instagram handle at the bottom of the screen there. And thank you for listening.